The humid air of Tampa carried the faint smell of salt from nearby Tampa Bay, mixed with the earthy scent of late summer rain. On August 12, 2004, 17-year-old Melissa Torres walked down the quiet side street near her home, clutching a notebook filled with poetry and sketches. It was 6:17 p.m., the kind of warm evening where the light lingers just long enough to make shadows stretch across sidewalks and lawns. Melissa's mother, Rosa, called from the porch to remind her daughter to hurry. Melissa waved, smiled, and promised she would be home in a few minutes. No one saw the car that slowed at the end of the block. No one noticed the shadow that fell over the last steps Melissa took before she vanished. There was no struggle, no cry, just silence where a vibrant young woman had been minutes before. Her disappearance rippled through Tampa, leaving friends, family, and neighbors in disbelief. For 20 years, that August evening haunted them, unresolved and unanswered. Melissa had been the kind of girl whose presence lit up rooms. At 17, she stood 56, with long chestnut hair and deep brown eyes that reflected an artist's curiosity. Her bedroom walls were plastered with sketches, magazine clippings, and small postcards from her dreams of traveling the world. She loved painting, writing poetry, and volunteering at the local animal shelter. Her father, Javier Torres, remembered her laughter as a constant presence in their modest townhouse. And her mother, Rosa, often told investigators that Melissa had an empathy that made everyone around her feel seen. That Thursday, Melissa had returned home from Hillsborough High School at 3:45 p.m., attended a brief art club meeting, and then ran errands for her mother, picking up groceries at the corner store. Security footage, grainy but intact, shows her at 5:02 p.m. purchasing milk, eggs, and a small chocolate bar with exact change. She lingered a moment to chat with the cashier about a new shipment of sketchbooks. By 5:15 p.m., she was leaving, adjusting her backpack strap, unaware that the steps she took next would become the last known moments of her life. By 6:30 p.m., as the sky darkened with the threat of rain, Rosa Torres called the store to ask if Melissa had returned. The clerk confirmed she had left nearly an hour earlier. Panic set in quickly. Javier drove the neighborhood streets, calling her name. Neighbors stepped out, searching lawns, driveways, and alleys. By 8:00 p.m., the local police were notified. Patrol officers, joined by volunteers, scoured the nearby streets and the small wooded area behind Melissa's apartment complex. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and no trace was found. Investigators combed through every possible lead. They interviewed classmates, teachers, and Melissa's friends, uncovering nothing that could explain her disappearance. A partial sighting from a delivery driver placed a small dark sedan near the complex at 6:25 p.m., but no plates were recorded, and the description was limited. Family members clung to hope, holding vigils each evening on the corner where she was last seen. Friends printed posters and the local news ran stories, but the trail was cold. As the years passed, the search persisted but dwindled. Melissa's parents refused to leave her bedroom untouched, leaving her art supplies, sketches, and journals in place. Friends continued to remember her on birthdays, on anniversaries, and at local art events she would have attended. Law enforcement occasionally revisited the file, checking new leads or tips from other missing persons cases, but each lead ended with frustration. By 2018, technological advances offered a glimmer of hope. A newly formed cold case unit in Florida had begun reviewing unsolved cases from the early 2000s, using DNA testing and forensic re-examination methods unavailable at the time of the initial investigation. Investigators discovered a cigarette butt collected near the complex on the night Melissa disappeared, preserved but never tested due to the limits of early 2000s forensic science. That small piece of evidence would ultimately provide the breakthrough decades in the making. Detective Laura Benson, assigned to the case, recalled reviewing the old files. The care with which evidence had been preserved was extraordinary, even if the urgency at the time had been diluted by a lack of results. Every note, photograph, and personal effect was meticulously cataloged. In January 2019, DNA testing on the cigarette butt yielded a match that was not in any known criminal database. This led the team to employ forensic genetic genealogy, comparing the unknown DNA to distant relatives and slowly narrowing the field of potential suspects. By mid-2019, investigators had identified a suspect with ties to Tampa and a history of eluding detection. Surveillance, discarded items, and further DNA testing confirmed that the individual's profile matched the unknown sample with near certainty. For 20 years, Melissa Torres' family had waited for an answer, and now science had provided it. The discovery would not just close a case, it would shatter assumptions about safety in the neighborhood and the people they trusted. Rosa and Javier Torres, now older but resolute, were summoned to law enforcement to review the results. When told the identity of the suspect, their first reaction was disbelief. This was someone who had been part of the community, someone neighbors waved to at the corner store, someone whose presence had seemed ordinary, unthreatening. The reality forced a reckoning. How long had this person been hiding in plain sight? How many times had they smiled at the family while harboring a terrible secret? Law enforcement prepared to make the arrest, careful to execute a warrant without alerting the suspect. On the morning of July 15, 2019, agents moved in. Cameras captured the moment the suspect was taken into custody, surprised, defiant, and ultimately subdued. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known the suspect for years were left grappling with disbelief and betrayal. People questioned every interaction, every smile, and every casual greeting. The evidence collected, combined with newly recovered DNA, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Investigators re-examined Melissa's belongings, photographs, and diary entries, constructing a timeline that would leave little room for doubt. The case was no longer just a cold file. It became a story of persistence, the power of science, and the resilience of a family that refused to give up. For the first time in 2 decades, the community of Tampa could begin to see answers emerge from the shadows of uncertainty. Melissa Torres' voice, preserved in her art, her writing, and her memory, had guided investigators to the truth. Her family, long burdened by unanswered questions, could now start the slow, painful process of closure, knowing the person responsible for her disappearance had finally been held accountable. Even as the arrest was celebrated quietly by the family and law enforcement, it was impossible to ignore the long-lasting emotional impact. Friends remembered Melissa at memorials, in school hallways, and in the empty spaces her absence had created. Each recovered detail, each DNA match, each witness statement stitched together the story that had been lost for 20 years. The small acts of remembrance and the advances in forensic science had converged to bring resolution. The weeks following the arrest were tense. Tampa's small streets, once familiar and comforting, felt uneasy as whispers spread through neighborhoods. People who had known the suspect casually for years now replayed moments in their minds, searching for signs they had missed. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, friends looked at each other with quiet questions, and Melissa's family tried to navigate a storm of emotions that ranged from relief to heartbreak. Javier Torres found himself walking past the corner where Melissa had last been seen countless times. The corner that had once been an ordinary part of his daily routine had transformed into a symbol of loss and endurance. He paused to remember her laugh, the way she had waved as she walked home from the corner store, her backpack swinging slightly as she skipped down the street. He had pictured those moments for 20 years, holding onto hope even when hope felt like a fragile thing. Now, the arrest made those memories sharper, heavier, but also tinged with the possibility of justice. Detective Laura Benson and her team went back to the evidence room to re-examine every item connected to Melissa's disappearance. The cigarette butt had been the breakthrough, but the investigation was far from over. Officers retraced the suspect's movements in 2004, visiting old workplaces, neighborhood hangouts, and the few places Melissa had been on that fateful August evening. They interviewed neighbors again, some of whom remembered vague incidents, strange cars, unfamiliar faces, that had seemed unimportant at the time but now fit into a larger pattern. The suspect, whose name law enforcement withheld until charges were formally filed, had managed to live a quiet life for years. Friends and neighbors described them as polite, unassuming, and even helpful. The contrast between the public persona and the private actions that led to Melissa's disappearance created a shockwave through the community. People struggled to reconcile their memories of the suspect with the evidence that had emerged. For the Torres family, the confirmation that the suspect had been found alive and in custody brought an intense mixture of emotions. Relief was quickly tempered by grief. Rosa Torres remembered lying in bed at night, thinking about the last time she saw Melissa. She remembered the way Melissa had waved, how she had promised to be home soon, and the emptiness that followed when that promise was broken. For 20 years, she had carried the uncertainty like a shadow, and while the arrest could not erase the past, it offered the first tangible hope for closure. Legal preparations moved swiftly. The case, already supported by compelling DNA evidence, was bolstered by detailed investigative notes and corroborating witness statements. Prosecutors knew the trial would be high-profile. The public was deeply invested in seeing justice served. They prepared to present not only the physical evidence but also the narrative of Melissa's life, the profound impact of her disappearance, and the persistence of investigators over 2 decades. Defense attorneys faced a challenge. The DNA match was nearly indisputable, supported by modern forensic methods and meticulous preservation of evidence. They attempted to question the handling of the original investigation, suggesting that some procedures in 2004 might have been flawed. However, the cold case unit had anticipated these arguments, documenting every chain of custody, every storage method, and every testing step with precision. The meticulous nature of the investigation ultimately strengthened the prosecution's position. Community members played a quiet but important role. Many attended vigils and memorials for Melissa, placing flowers, candles, and handwritten notes at the corner where she had disappeared. High school friends remembered her artwork and poetry, reading aloud passages that captured her personality and dreams. The collective act of remembrance reinforced the gravity of the case and the importance of seeing justice fulfilled. As the trial date approached, the emotional weight on the Torres family intensified. Each day brought new news coverage, discussions with attorneys, and preparations for testimony. Javier spent hours reviewing notes and photographs, making sure he could accurately convey his memories of Melissa to the court. Rosa focused on her own recollections, rehearsing the moments she wanted to share about Melissa's character, her kindness, and the daily routines that made her daughter unforgettable. The family knew the trial would be both painful and necessary. The prosecution worked to construct a clear timeline. They reconstructed the suspect's movements on the evening of August 12, 2004, showing how Melissa had been followed from the corner store to the street near her home. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses, previously overlooked, was enhanced and used to identify the suspect's car. Witness statements, including minor observations from neighbors who had seen a car parked unusually on the block, were compiled into a cohesive picture. The meticulous assembly of these details created a narrative that left little room for doubt. One of the most compelling aspects of the case was the use of genetic genealogy. By tracing distant relatives of the suspect through public DNA databases, investigators had narrowed down the field and ultimately connected the suspect to the preserved DNA from the cigarette butt. This innovative approach, relatively new in 2019, had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. In this case, it bridged the gap between a 20-year-old mystery and the modern era of forensic science. In pretrial hearings, the defense raised questions about the validity of using genealogical methods, suggesting privacy concerns and potential inaccuracies. Prosecutors responded by demonstrating the rigorous standards followed in every step of the testing, ensuring that the results were scientifically sound and admissible in court. The judge ultimately allowed the evidence, recognizing its pivotal role in identifying the suspect and providing closure to a long-suffering family. Throughout this period, media coverage highlighted the human dimension of the case. Reporters visited Melissa's old school, spoke with former teachers, and interviewed neighbors who had lived alongside the Torres family for decades. They shared stories of Melissa's creativity, her love for animals, and her compassionate nature. The portrayal of her life before the tragedy reminded the public that the investigation was not just about solving a crime, but honoring the life of a young woman whose absence had left an indelible mark. Counselors and psychologists worked with the Torres family to help them navigate the stress of the trial. The long wait, the media attention, and the anticipation of testimony created a complex emotional landscape. Family members found solace in small routines, visiting Melissa's favorite park, maintaining her art supplies, and speaking to friends who had known her. These rituals grounded them, providing strength and perspective amid the intensity of the legal proceedings. As jury selection began, the atmosphere in Tampa was tense but hopeful. Jurors were carefully screened for biases, ensuring they could weigh evidence fairly and objectively. Many were aware of the case through news reports, but the court emphasized the importance of considering only what was presented during the trial. Lawyers prepared to walk through 2 decades of investigation, demonstrating the evolution of forensic science and the careful preservation of evidence that had ultimately led to the suspect's identification. During opening statements, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of Melissa's life and disappearance. They highlighted her creativity, her bright personality, and the devastating impact of her absence on the community. They described the painstaking work of investigators, the preservation of evidence, and the breakthrough that led to the suspect's arrest. The defense attempted to cast doubt on specific elements, but the clear DNA evidence and corroborating details made it difficult to challenge the fundamental facts of the case. Over the following days, witnesses took the stand. Neighbors recounted observations from 2004, sometimes minor but collectively forming a crucial timeline. Law enforcement officers described the forensic analysis in detail, explaining how the cigarette butt was collected, preserved, and ultimately tested. Experts in genetic genealogy outlined the methods used to connect the DNA to distant relatives and narrow the suspect's identity. Each piece added depth, clarity, and credibility to the narrative. Melissa's parents, though filled with emotion, remained composed. They testified about their daughter's life, her routines, and the profound impact her disappearance had on the family. Their words carried weight not just because of the tragedy, but because of the unwavering love and resilience they had demonstrated over 2 decades. Friends shared memories of Melissa's art and kindness, further humanizing the victim and reinforcing the importance of justice. The trial was grueling, emotional, and intense. The defense continued to challenge the evidence, but the weight of scientific proof, combined with the detailed investigative work and compelling testimony, left little room for alternative explanations. Every witness, every piece of evidence, and every detail from the cold case file contributed to a picture that was undeniable. The suspect was responsible for Melissa Torres' disappearance and the suffering endured by her family. By the time closing arguments were presented, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. The prosecution summarized the meticulous investigation, the breakthrough DNA evidence, and the dedication of law enforcement over 20 years. They reminded the jury of Melissa's life, her talents, and the injustice of the prolonged uncertainty her family had endured. The defense, while presenting their case for doubt, could not overcome the combination of physical evidence and the compelling narrative constructed by investigators. As the jury retired to deliberate, tension filled the courtroom. Outside, members of the community, friends, and family waited anxiously. The news cameras captured the somber expressions of those who had followed the case for years. For the Torres family, the moment was surreal. 20 years of waiting, hopping, and fearing were now reaching a critical conclusion. The jury deliberated for several hours, a span of time that felt like an eternity for everyone in the courtroom. For the Torres family, each passing minute brought a swirl of memories, regrets, and hopes. Rosa clutched her hands tightly, feeling the familiar ache of 20 years of uncertainty. Javier stared at the floor, trying to steady his breathing as he imagined Melissa's smile, the way she had once rushed home from school, laughing at something trivial yet unforgettable. Every tick of the clock reminded them how much had been lost, and yet how close they were to finally knowing the truth. When the jury finally returned, the room went silent. The judge called everyone to attention and asked the foreperson to read the verdict. The words echoed through the chamber, guilty on all counts. The suspect's face, previously calm and composed, registered the first flicker of emotion, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a fleeting glance at the floor. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, a mixture of relief, vindication, and the finality of justice served. Rosa sank into her chair, tears streaming freely. She had imagined this moment countless times but never believed it would actually arrive. Javier wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her tightly as they both tried to process the gravity of the verdict. Their grief had not disappeared, nor would it ever. But for the first time in 2 decades, the uncertainty that had haunted every day was replaced by the undeniable knowledge that the person responsible for taking Melissa from them was finally being held accountable. Outside the courtroom, the small Tampa community gathered, watching news crews report the verdict live. Many had known Melissa, some remembered her from school, some from the neighborhood, and all had been touched in some way by the mystery that lingered for so long. The reaction was quiet, reflective, but deeply emotional. People spoke of relief, of hope, and of a strange kind of closure. While the past could not be undone, the verdict allowed a measure of peace to settle over a town that had carried the weight of this crime for 20 years. The Torres family returned home, carrying the heavy, complicated mixture of emotions that often follows a long-fought legal battle. Rosa wandered into Melissa's old room, now preserved as a memorial of sorts. Her journals, art supplies, and favorite books sat exactly as they had been, untouched for decades. Rosa ran her fingers over the pages, remembering the bright, curious girl who had once filled this room with laughter, music, and dreams. She felt a quiet connection to Melissa in those moments, a way to bridge the past and the present. Javier began working with investigators and prosecutors to provide testimony for the sentencing phase. He described the impact of Melissa's disappearance on the family, the relentless grief, and the coping mechanisms they had developed over the years. Each detail added to the court's understanding of the profound consequences of the crime, emphasizing the human cost beyond the forensic evidence and procedural details. The judge listened intently, absorbing the weight of 2 decades of loss. The sentencing was sobering but necessary. The court acknowledged the meticulous investigation, the significance of the DNA breakthrough, and the courage of the family in pursuing justice despite the passage of time. The suspect received a lengthy prison sentence, ensuring that they would be held accountable and that the community could finally begin the slow process of healing. The decision did not erase the pain, but it served as a formal recognition of the wrongs committed and the perseverance of those who had fought tirelessly for truth and justice. As months passed, the Torres family began to rebuild their lives in small, meaningful ways. They started community programs to support families of missing persons, sharing their story and offering guidance to those navigating similar struggles. Rosa spoke at local schools, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the persistence of justice. Javier worked with local law enforcement to advise on cold case protocols, ensuring that Melissa's case contributed to future successes in the field. Their involvement provided purpose, transforming their personal tragedy into a force for good. The neighborhood around Melissa's home slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Streets once shadowed by suspicion became places of cautious optimism. Children played in yards without the lingering fear that had hung in the air for years. Neighbors greeted each other with renewed warmth, and the community collectively honored the memory of Melissa through murals, commemorative plaques, and annual gatherings. These acts of remembrance served as both tribute and reassurance that Melissa's life had meaning, and her story had prompted vigilance, compassion, and change. Investigators involved in the case reflected on the journey that had begun in 2004. They marveled at the advances in forensic science that made it possible to solve a case that had seemed hopeless for years. The integration of DNA analysis, meticulous evidence preservation, and innovative genealogical methods had created a blueprint for solving other cold cases. Officers often cited Melissa's case as an example of dedication, patience, and the power of never giving up, no matter how much time had passed. For the Torres family, healing was gradual. There were still moments of sadness, flashes of grief that surfaced unexpectedly, and the inevitable reminders of what had been lost. Yet alongside the sorrow was an enduring sense of justice, a recognition that perseverance had led to accountability, and an acknowledgement that Melissa's life had been honored through the tireless efforts of those who refused to forget her. The balance of grief and relief became their new reality, one that allowed them to remember Melissa with love rather than fear. Media coverage of the case continued, highlighting the successful use of modern forensic techniques and the importance of cold case units. Documentaries, news features, and online stories chronicled the decades-long journey, ensuring that Melissa's story would educate, inspire, and remind people that even long-forgotten cases could find resolution. Experts discussed how combining traditional investigative work with innovative DNA and genealogical methods could finally provide closure for families who had endured years of uncertainty. Rosa and Javier often visited Melissa's favorite park, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings. They talked to children, sharing small lessons about kindness, vigilance, and community. Each visit became a ritual of remembrance, a way to maintain a connection with Melissa while acknowledging the changes in their own lives. These outings offered both solace and purpose, reminding them that life, even after tragedy, could carry meaning and hope. In court, the suspect's incarceration became a reference point for other investigations. Law enforcement cited the case in training programs, emphasizing the importance of evidence preservation and the potential of modern forensic science to rewrite outcomes long after crimes had occurred. Melissa's case demonstrated that persistence and technological innovation could bridge decades, providing justice even when time had created distance and uncertainty. Years later, the small Tampa community looked back on the events of 2004 and the resolution that came in 2025 with a mixture of relief and reflection. Streets once marked by tension now bore quiet strength. Families shared stories about Melissa, celebrating her creativity, kindness, and spirit. Memorials and community events ensured that her life would not be forgotten, transforming her story from one of loss into a narrative of resilience, remembrance, and enduring hope. Rosa Torres often spoke to journalists, describing the emotional journey her family had endured. She emphasized the importance of never giving up, of trusting investigators, and of holding on to the belief that truth, no matter how delayed, could emerge. Javier, too, shared insights into the legal and investigative processes, highlighting how collaboration, modern science, and unrelenting commitment could bring answers to families who had waited decades. Their voices, tempered by grief but strengthened by determination, offered guidance and inspiration to countless others facing similar challenges. As they walked through the neighborhood that had once felt so heavy with uncertainty, Rosa and Javier felt a cautious sense of peace. They could remember Melissa not only through the pain of loss, but also through the affirmation of justice served. Their lives were forever marked by the tragedy, yet they had emerged with a renewed commitment to community, remembrance, and the transformative power of perseverance. The case became a symbol, not just for Tampa, but for families everywhere. It showed that no matter how long the wait, no matter how deep the grief, persistent effort, modern science, and the courage to pursue truth could provide answers. Melissa's story was a reminder that even when justice seems delayed, it is not denied. The victory, hard won and long awaited, belonged not only to the Torres family, but to a community that had never forgotten, to investigators who refused to give up, and to the enduring legacy of a young woman whose life, though cut short, left an indelible mark on those who loved her. Even as the years passed, the name Melissa Torres remained in the hearts of those who had known her, and in the history of law enforcement as a testament to the power of persistence, compassion, and modern forensic science. Families in similar situations drew strength from her story, inspired to continue seeking truth despite decades of uncertainty. The case illustrated that the passage of time cannot erase accountability, that love and remembrance can coexist with grief, and that justice, no matter how delayed, has the power to heal and affirm the lives it touches. For Tampa, for the Torres family, and for the countless investigators and supporters who had labored quietly behind the scenes, the resolution of Melissa Torres' case marked an ending, yes, but also a beginning, a chance to honor a life, to heal, and to ensure that her memory remained a guiding light for generations to come.